Please listen carefully.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Listen Up with me, David Bellamy from Harkn. Once again, I'm joined by our brand and content manager, Lydia Blundell, and this week we're going to be taking the subject of workplace wellbeing to pieces, right? So we share a lot of this on social media, and we wanted to just spend an hour or so talking about all the things that we think about, our own journey in it, and some of the things that I think really matter out there right now in terms of wellbeing. So, hi Lydia, thanks for joining me again.
Hello, good to be back. Yeah, as you say, workplace wellbeing is something that we talk about fairly often. And before we get going on today's episode, let me quickly plug our new eBook, which is called Embedding Wellbeing in Workplace Culture. It's a brilliant resource, whether you're just interested in this topic, whether you're a HR and wellbeing professional, senior leader who wants to do more to support their people. It will prove a worthwhile read, we hope. So I'll leave a link to download that in the description for this video.
Great
now,
plug.
Into today's episode, Workplace Wellbeing Unpacked. I thought we would start with a little bit of a comparison exercise, if you like, because you and I entered the workplace at very different times. So I got my first job slap bang in the middle of the pandemic back in 2020, and you entered the workplace quite a lot prior to that. Perhaps you'd rather not put a specific date on it, but I wanted to start by asking you, some of the phrases that we're going to be talking about in this episode: workplace wellbeing, burnout. Did they exist back then, back in the dark ages, or are they more of a recent phenomenon?
Sorry, yeah. Let's be clear. I'm not that bloody old, right? But I'm curious, right? So before we start, why don't we? Let me flip it right back to you. Right, so you started in the pandemic. So anybody listening to this, I think we all have different expectations today, and I'll talk about mine in a moment. But talk to me about your experience. So when you joined work or started work in the pandemic, talk about what it was like, what you think about how, and even your expectations around well-being as part of your employment. I'll be noting this as your employer as well.
Yeah, I think when I was looking for my first job, I was working part-time as a runner in TV and radio, taking all the poorly paid night shifts while also being a student. So wellbeing wasn't major for me at that point, but expectations is a different thing, because when I was then looking for my first full-time job, and the same goes for lots of my peers, you're looking at job descriptions a lot more holistically. So it's not just pay, it's work-life balance, it's the statements that the company is making about their culture and how they care about their people. That was definitely a dominant part of decision-making processes. And then ever since, in my career trajectory, it's something you take into consideration. I'd also say circumstantial things. Graduating in the pandemic, remote work was already normalized. So lots of those kind of societal factors, there weren't many in my kind of cohort who are going to be willing to do a 2-hour round trip commute and all the costs that incurs and the sort of impact on work-life balance without very good justifications. I think we definitely came in with a set of expectations and a set of perspectives, and all the language around workplace wellbeing was, flourishing, and because also the pandemic gave us a more general awareness of the importance of looking after yourself, of looking after your mental and physical health, perhaps like going at a slightly slower pace. So that was the outlook, I suppose.
Yeah, brilliant, really interesting. I think so. We'll talk a bit more about the pandemic and its effects later on, won't we? But that's quite different than my experience. I think I can speak for myself, but loosely, I was talking to somebody about this earlier this week, funnily enough, somebody I used to work with about 20 years ago. Work, when I joined it, So my first job was 1995. We didn't talk about well-being. Of course, there was no option to work from home, and work-life balance was what it was. And I think, it's not wildly different. It wasn't like we weren't working in Victorian sort of work hours, but but work was different, right? So firstly, I went to work, I think, with the mindset that many of my generation would have done. So early 20s, in the mid 90s, talking about or understanding that work was largely about sort of climbing this greasy pole. So you kind of do what you do what's required. You put up with stuff. And you just make do. And that's, that's slightly different to today in terms of expectation, isn't it? I didn't have any expectations of well-being. I think that part of that, and this is the conversation I was having this week, right? So there are moments when I can remember being under, as my career developed, being under extreme pressure or feeling under extreme pressure, and being aware of behavioural implications, if that makes sense. So you start to become a bit more prickly, and you start to maybe drink a bit more and smoke a bit more and all those sorts of things, and you'll be out later in, so working longer hours and that sort of stuff that, but there was no attachment to, so the behaviors to anything that might be underlying, right? So the pressure we're putting people under. And I think that you either survived or you didn't. And there are moments, and I've spoken to a few people in recent years that I worked with, who sort of disappeared out of the company, and they, had a breakdown of sorts, or just, became overcome by stress, and took some time out. But they, people sort of disappeared and didn't come back. And I'll tell anybody that one of the biggest breaks I got in consulting, sort of in the early 2000s, came when, one of my colleagues and sort of team leader of the time was going through some personal issues and kind of had a breakdown in the room. So we were, with a client, and he just got overwhelmed and became a bit teary. And I just remember him sort of getting up, and the partner in the room saying, like, you go, David, your project. And that was it, and I think that that sort of stuff, I think that's changed dramatically. Those in the consulting industry still might say it, they shed lots of people for lots of reasons over time, but they're highly demanding environments where people get paid a lot, largely, I suspect, as an anesthetic to all the other things that they have to put up with. But in general terms, I think our outlook has changed dramatically. There you go. So that was it. Not that long ago, but feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, and a couple of things you alluded to there. I think even in my generation, there is still people who think, this is going to be rubbish for like 20 years, but I'm going to make loads of money, and it's going to be worthwhile. Short-term success, but massively at the sacrifice of work-life balance. But I would say that it's becoming less mainstream, and a lot more people kind of question that element of their lives, I'd say. Before we get, I think perhaps it's worth, before we continue, is just talking about what we mean by workplace wellbeing and what that phrase means today, because, and we've done a lot of work on this, you are talking about quite a specific set of causes and effects, and wellbeing on its own means something, work means something. What does well-being at work mean for our purposes?
Yeah, okay, and that's an important point. I mean, I think as we are talking about it, so if I put my sort of Harkn hat on for a minute and say, well, when we're talking about workplace well-being, and I think this is probably true for the sorts of organisations that we work with as well, the well-being, of course, whole person type stuff. But I think in the modern workplace, we can probably move a whole bunch of the physical well-being pieces to one side. And because, health and safety legislation as it is means that very few people go to work today fearing serious harm. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but fearing serious harm, because we've taken care of a whole set of risks that we would once have encountered and dealt with. You watch YouTube and watch some of the things that people used to do, outdoor work, for example. It's not office-based stuff, but I'm watching a Blue Peter clip from years ago where they've got one of the presenters climbing Nelson's column, in Trafalgar Square, and he's just climbing on a ladder without a rope or anything. And I'm thinking, my God, this is bananas. And that's what the guys used to do to clean it. But so health and safety legislation being what it is, physical risk at work is largely diminished. Then you've got the sort of the upside bit. So healthy eating, moving about and making sure, a healthy sort of lifestyle. And that is interesting because we don't mandate that at work. Yes, we make lots of provision for it. We want people to have access to gyms and to be able to be physically healthy. But that's the sort of individual bit. So I'm going to park that as well, right? So yes, it's important to do. We don't make people do it. And so then we come back and you've got the other side. So emotional risk, mental health risk, psychosocial risk. So when we look at mental health, there's a further distinction I'd like to make, right? So one is how we deal with mental health in the workplace in terms of people with diagnosed mental health conditions. I think that's slightly different to the psychosocial risks that result in mental health harm, damage, risk, as it manifests in people. Because I think that I think they get conflated when we talk about mental health at work. I mean, I think I think those bits often get conflated. We can treat people who have long-term mental health conditions incredibly well. So people are much more sensitive to that stuff, and organisations can do a good job, whilst at the same time sort of missing the fact that work is in many cases causing mental health issues. And I want to use an example, a model, if you like, and a guy called David Rock, and he wrote Your Brain at Work, I think his book was, but in it he presents a model called the SCARF model. And the reason it's interesting is I think it sort of highlights for me where we should be looking, right? Because it's SCARF is a simple sort of acronym that relates to causes of stress. The reason I like the SCARF model is it's so easy for us to see the sorts of triggers for stress that we encounter at work with regularity, right? So thinking about status, it's largely what prevents us from, or threats to status, put it that way, right? Largely what prevents us from speaking up in groups, right? We often mistake, so it's a psychological safety thing, but actually it's the fear if I ask a question that somebody else has asked, or I'm going to look stupid, or whatever it might be. I don't want to look less capable. I don't want to look less capable than I am. Right? So and that's a pretty common thing. Certainty. Well, this is massive, isn't it, right now? So we are in this kind of hyper rapid and evolving workplace. Lots of uncertainty. Most people, I think, working in knowledge economy faces a degree of uncertainty all of the time about what they're doing and what's expected of them. And there's a whole load of things in there. But if we just think about the speed of change that society and organizations are facing right now, and we've talked previously about the number of new changes that are happening in organizations, that sort of uncertainty is part and parcel of our working life. So a big driver of stress for us. Autonomy, it's our desire, our need for autonomy is what drives the big push for give me better work-life balance. Let me work where I want to work, not come back to the office and have to make that big commitment every day just to be in the same space when I'm going to spend all day on Teams. So we want and we need to have control over as much of our life as possible. And much of the sort of leading thinking around progressive organisations is about increasing, that freedom and trying to balance that with responsibility. Relatedness, big loser, isn't it, out of the change to the way we work. So how connected we feel, how much time we spend together, how closely our teams work. And it's why we watch CEOs repeatedly trying to cling on to this idea of, why you should come back to work is that because we work better together. And actually there's some merit in the idea of relatedness, or the risk of disconnection, being a driver of additional stress. But at the same time, we could do more with building relationships and building connection in other ways, right? So, and the last one is fairness. And I just want to pick up on something topical that we talked about earlier in the week. Which is, when you think about threats to fairness or fears, the stress that is driven by lack of fairness, when we don't feel like processes are equal through the organisation, you and I have just watched a video, haven't we, about somebody being let go by an organisation and they weren't explaining why, and what she was expressing was a whole load of issues with fairness. And when we look at the 4th of January thing, where that's the day when most FTSE 100 CEOs have earned as much as their median employee will earn in an entire year, well, that's going to trigger some fairness stuff. Now, I want to add to this, right? So that's a universally sort of comprehensive set set of the sort of risks that cause stress, or universally agreed stressors, I should say. The thing that I think makes this whole subject really interesting, and I know we'll talk more about, is that they don't affect us all equally or universally. So that we know they are primary drivers of stress, and that work is a significant driver of stress, and it's the work environment and the work conditions, for all the reasons I've just said, that cause stress in people. We don't all experience in the same way. It doesn't manifest us in the same way. And also, my final point on this is that we must think about it as much less like it's always going to be a traumatic event, but more often a sort of pebble in the shoe, so the grinding down effect. So we experience this stuff on an ongoing and repeated nature, to triggering stress all day long, every day, without appropriate outlets, and it will eventually have an effect. And that's ultimately where burnout comes from. And I think, if I'm right, that you've got the definition from the World Health Organization, the burnout definition.
I do. So the World Health Organization defines burnout as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, characterized by 3 dimensions: increased mental distance from one's job, feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. They describe burnout as an occupational phenomenon, which just shows how much it is embedded in the environment, I think. But yeah, that was a good overview, going through the SCARF model of how stress manifests in the workplace. It brings me on to kind of, if stress is being caused by our environment and impacting how we feel when we're at work, then how is this impacting engagement and therefore performance? And lots of studies have pointed for a long time to the link between wellbeing and engagement. And I've been immersing myself in some statistics recently. So I'm just going to reel through them. Deloitte recorded that wellbeing problems cost UK employers on average 56 billion between 2020 and 2021, and that's up from 45 billion the year before. Recent research from them also attributes 40% of employee turnover costs to mental health problems. Mental Health UK reported last year that 1 in 5 UK workers are unable to manage stress and pressure at work. And finally, remarkably, the Deloitte C-suite study found that 57% of employees are considering quitting their job for one that better supports their well-being, which is bad enough, but an even higher share of executives, 70%, say that they plan to quit for the same reason. So the people who are directly managing those employees who want to quit for poor well-being want to quit themselves because they're not coping with their own levels of stress and burnout. So the costs are clear, right? And the business case, as well as the moral case for investing more in employee wellbeing couldn't be more clear. But CIPD, survey provider, 2022 report, 51% of organisations are taking a strategic approach to wellbeing. 51%, half, given those serious financial costs of the kind of crisis that they're finding themselves in. That feels like a disconnect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is, isn't it? And I'm conscious before anybody comments on this particular bit. Of course, when we talk about, was it 56 billion? The Deloitte thing. That's not on average. That's in total. It's not an average of 56 billion. That would be more than most companies. Yeah, that's all right. But no, it's okay. But because but the number's right. That's a significant amount of money. It's a big amount of money anyway. But there is a disconnect, and I think there's lots of reasons on there. I mean, it's why even when you just pick up engagement for a second, you say, well, one of the things I really liked about that World Health Organization definition is it actually sounds a bit like disengagement, doesn't it? It's the beginnings of the slope. So I'm starting to feel a bit less connected to this thing. I'm feeling a bit less like I want to invest anymore. I'm running out of personal resources, so I disengage, and then we get the stuff like presenteeism, which I know has a sort of turning up to work when unwell label, but showing up unable and unwilling, if you like, to contribute, largely the same thing, in many respects, before you get into more significant outcomes. But I also think there are some other factors at play here. So why don't we see? So people are spending like a shed load of money on well-being. There's no question about that. Lots and lots of organisations are trying to do the thing. And you talked about, half are making, doing it strategically. I think that's an interesting question in itself. I guess the definitions of strategic in that context would differ wildly. But companies are spending lots and lots of money on solutions, which is one thing. But often, and I still believe this is, in absence of any meaningful sort of insight about their own organisation, it becomes a bit tick boxy. So we'll get one of these and one of these and one of these and one of these, and we'll get gym membership, and that will solve the problem. And I know we're going to talk about that because there has been this really interesting report produced by Oxford University this week, isn't there, about individualized well-being interventions. But the other side of this same thing is that a bit like toxic workplaces and that sort of whole idea, we don't tend to recognize them of the place that we are in. So that I don't. In absence of some really clear data around X number of people are burned out right now, which is a hard number to get because, of course, who's telling you that? What happens is, and this came from a conversation with one of the NHS trusts a few years ago, where they said, what happens to us during winter is, and when people are experiencing extreme levels of stress, they just don't come to work as much. Because they don't come to work as much because that sort of cold or the sort of the grit in the shoe, as I mentioned, or pebble in the shoe, just becomes too much. So that probably isn't recorded as stress, burnout, or mental health related risk. It's just sickness absence, and arguably seasonal. Right. The other thing is we tend to have a sort of positive outlook on the place that we work in. So nobody wants to work in a place that causes people harm. A few very public examples perhaps aside, but the the majority of us go to work and we think of our workplaces, it's not like that. It's okay, and we don't notice it of ourselves. So that there's a bunch of reasons why I think there's a disconnect. But there's a lot of stuff that people can do differently now as well, right?
So, in fairness, lots of organisations are undoubtedly trying their best, right, in this area. They're aware of the moral imperative, they're aware of the business imperative, but nonetheless, all those statistics show that we're just not making the progress that we need to be making in this area. And I know you've already touched on the University of Oxford study, which is a great study. It came out earlier this week. But just before we go into that, another statistic from Deloitte is that 68% of employees don't engage with their organisation's wellbeing initiatives because they are either, quote, too time-consuming, too confusing, or too cumbersome. And that raises the question of it's not just a matter of whether you're investing more in wellbeing, but whether you're investing in the right ways. And the University of Oxford's study's kind of headline is, wellbeing initiatives like meditation apps and wellness initiatives just don't work because they treat the individual and not the context. So do you want to unpack that a little bit? I know it's something we've done a lot of work on. And what are the biggest challenges for organisations here, and where are they kind of missing that mark?
Yeah, and I think that the didn't the report say that there was no evidence of any positive impact? It was that, rather than than they don't work. I think there's the distinction here. So again, it's a bit like you can't solve physical risks at work by going to the gym, right? That individualized approach, I think, is sort of the crux of the issue, isn't it? But listen, we've said that for a long time. The normal cycle of things, and I could be really unkind about some of this stuff, but the cycle of things for people at work is you've got a whole bunch of things that I've talked about already. So just imagine a job that you've done in the past, imagine one you're doing right now, and think about the stress that emerges in our day-to-day lives, right? It's real for us, even in a business like ours, where everybody's experiencing this stuff. And when it gets challenging for us, do I think that meditation can help some people? Yeah, I do. Do I think that wellbeing apps can support individuals? Yeah, some people probably. But it's not in this. But it's it's a bit like some people will eat differently and get benefits from exercise, and some people get benefits from other things. They are solving one set of issues, and they work for some people sometimes. Resilience training, sure, do it. Right? I think they're good things to do, all of these things, but they are not going to solve the problem that we're trying to address. And so the way we've defined this, we just come back to it, is the sort of psychosocial risk presented by work today. I think we talked about lots of them, but there's loads more we could also talk about. Endless amounts of work, unable to switch off, all that sort of stuff. Pressures around us, both in and outside work, mean that life's challenging. No amount of meditation, breathing exercises, rolling your shoulders at your desk, and lunch and learns are going to fix those things, right? And I think employees really feel that. That's the bottom line. We know that stigma. There's a lot of work been done around the mental health stigma and making it okay to talk. Again, the right sort of thing to do, but it needs to be coupled with some other things. We know that most people still largely only put their hands up and ask for help when they are absolutely prepared for consequences. And there are always going to be consequences. They're not the same consequences that I think I alluded to when I was talking about my initial experience at work, right? We aren't talking now about people who disappear in the night or just don't ever come back to work, or their career gets destroyed for it. But I think people still fear it might. Right, so that's one dimension. But we also know, and I'm just going to pick on stuff that I understand. Some from personal experience. If you turn up to work, well, if I turned up, just reverse our roles for a minute, right? And And I said, look, you know what, I'm really struggling right now. I'm going through some stuff. I'm finding it very difficult to focus, and I need a bit of time off, or whatever it might be. You know, one of the things that you might say in response to me, with all care and good intent, is take the time you want. You know, do what you need to do, and you're going to care about me, right? So I know that. But you might also say, well, look, you know, that presentation that we've got next week that's really important with that client, should you do that? Right? And in fact, you might go as far as saying, I don't want you to do that. You shouldn't do that. And so there are, you know, and then we're right back to other fears and pressures around our career line and, you know, or career trajectory. So there's just a load of stuff like that. So we know that, so we've got the sort of solutions at the back end, counselling, EAP, all that sort of stuff works when people are in crisis. It's not solving the risks. People are still not really open to talking about the stuff they're facing. And some of it probably also exists in, you know, the challenges associated with how easy it is to acknowledge and fix some of this stuff. So it all goes in the very difficult box. We've got too much work to do. Well, we can't control that. I haven't got any more money. We can't hire endless amounts of people, all that sort of stuff. So it just gets difficult. And then we end up, you know, making it worse. I don't know, I sort of drifted slightly off topic here from the individualized solutions, but the point is that they are the things. You know, you lose somebody out of your team to a period of burnout or stress, and they take some time out. Well, that extra workload goes into your team. You don't replace them. You can't, you know, you've got to magic up new resources, and you don't know when they're going to come back. So that sort of creates a sort of vicious cycle. And so long and short of all that is, you know, I think. And there was the article, wasn't there, in Mad World, which I'm just going to dive into for a second, if I might, because it seems timely. You know, it's this thing about measuring. You know, so we're looking. Everybody's looking at data. What can we learn about the efficacy of these initiatives? And the Oxford University study seems to have given us a reasonable, good response here. So, do they work? Don't they work? The article that we responded to was published by Make a Difference Media, if you remember, was talking about that, you know, there's much more we could do with data to track this stuff, and that's going to prove the case. Now, our response was, look, that's the wrong way of thinking about this, right? Behind all of this stuff and data and stresses are human stories, human experiences. As I said before, it's individualized to the extent that we all experience it differently, right? So we experience work differently. Our processing and coping mechanisms are all unique. The things that trigger me won't trigger you, and vice versa. So you end up then with the position where we need to get a better sense of early warning signs. How do we make it possible to learn about people entering periods of personal distress, crisis? How do we get there sooner? Because if we can get there sooner, then suddenly we change the game, right? That's the point. That's what we're doing with Harkn, isn't it? We're moving the dial on this sort of, if we can start a conversation about an individual needing help sooner and start to tackle awareness of the sorts of things that are causing systemic harm in the organization, I think then you start to get to an effective place where, you know, we're no longer sending cat videos to try and cheer each other up through difficult periods. What we're doing is we're starting to address the things that are actually going to make a difference to the entire organization and the likelihood of it achieving what it wants to. That makes sense? Suddenly got deep there.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's a great article on wellbeing data and how we can humanize wellbeing data. And I'm going to leave a link to it in the description. But allow me to just quote you back to you quickly, just to make you really uncomfortable. So you said in the response article, while integrating sophisticated data analytics into wellbeing initiatives is undoubtedly a step forward, I believe the journey doesn't end there. It's about evolving from static data points to dynamic, human-centric insights that empower real-time support and foster a culture of proactive well-being. So as I say, I will link to the article in the description, but what I wanted to just go into quickly was that this isn't just a point of view or a sort of theoretical perspective that we have. It's something that we've learned firsthand through our experiences with Harkn, and actually some of that realization of our capabilities with data and how we should be using data by accident is probably the wrong phrase, but as a byproduct of the work that we were doing anyway. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, great. And yeah, I like the way you just described that as well. I always describe it as accident, but it does sound like it more happenstance, isn't it, really? So if that's so one of those things where so this is the bit I'm going to talk a bit about Harkn, so forgive me if it's not product pushy in any way, or not intended to be, but it's important to understand the story or where we're coming from. So we build a platform to help organizations understand real life inside their firms through the lens of individual stories, right? So that's the daily check-in thing. And there's a moment, I tell this story often, but I'll tell it again, right? 2019, one of our clients sends me an email first thing on a Monday morning. We were looking at the wall, that's the narrative part of Harkn, the stories piece, how we've seen something we're a bit worried about, right? And so here's a comment and a rating. So a rating of 5. For those who don't know, 0 to 100 scale starts at 50. You have to choose to go one way or another. So rating of 5, quite significant and noticeable in our terms, right? So rating of 5 and really worried about the future. Don't know how I can afford to pay for the funeral, let alone get my family to it. I guess mum could have picked a better month to die, right? That's the narrative. And that makes uncomfortable reading for anybody, right? And somebody struggling, and that point, right? So it results in us, and we built this system for sort of team dynamic and team morale, motivation, happiness, and had no mechanism for understanding the sort of the individual story thing that I've just been describing. But we reconstruct the human, if you like, out of the data from our database, and then we discover here was somebody that, in our terms, in data terms, in Harkn, was utterly unremarkable just 6 weeks prior. I don't want to make her sound unremarkable, and it was a woman, but actually in data terms. So she checked in most days. She rated between 60 and 70, and she talked about life, stuff that we all talk about. So things about work, things about home, stuff that's going on in our day-to-day lives that she was choosing to share alongside the way she was feeling. And then the first reference to poorly mother, she drops. She starts rating into the 50s, so her rating drops to 50 something. And then a week or so of hovering around there, the company introduces a change to a couple of key processes which were related to shift allocation, and introduces a new system, right? So how often do we all experience that? It's going on all the time, right? Something new coming in, a new process to do stuff, but this had a broad effect because it created a great deal of uncertainty in many of the people, right? So then we watched, so she drops again into the 40s, and then the comments vacillate between declining mother's health and increasing financial insecurity as a result of this shift allocation process and rollout and all the stuff that was going on for many people. But then we watched this sort of straight line decline, and I think that was really interesting because that was a massive penny drop moment for me. So I'm sort of looking at the world through the lens of what everybody was happier at work and had, stuff I still believe in today, right? So what if people have more good days at work? That would be terrific. But the power in this data was suddenly that we could see retrospectively somebody experiencing personal crisis that was a straight line decline. And I tell you the thing, I would go further to say, a survey in the world that would have picked that up, right? You just could not have spotted that we were looking backwards. So let's be clear. So we've caught it at the end. But that created the impetus for us to go build the algorithms that would help us address the question that I was asking after that day, which is how, if we've got this data, how could we use it to stop us getting there again, right? How do we stop catching this lady at 5? How do we catch her at 50? And that we could do today, right? So that part of the journey I love, because it's the sad story for her, but the company reached out and she got some support, and of course, just for the avoidance of doubt, and anybody sitting there thinking, well, what could they have done anyway? Well, we know that you couldn't change the outcomes of her mother dying, right? But seeing that stuff earlier, removing the additional stress and the So being able to make an intervention around, or even understanding the sentiment of all of your employees that this change is impacting lots of people and it's going to harm folk, right? It's going to harm us as a business. It's going to see people drop out of work for a bit, maybe, and or in fact, as the emotional health declines, as the stress builds, and they stay in periods of experiencing bad days at work or increased pressures, their performance will decline. Right, so they will be ending up drifting into that stuff we heard about from the World Organization. So that story is important, but it doesn't stop there, because that part informs a lot of what followed, doesn't it? Today, by the way, we would have picked her up at that point of the fitness, right? So we would have had her inside the sort of the week after the change, if not in that initial week when mother was poorly. Right, so we would have got there much sooner, inside the second week. The world then changed for us, doesn't it? So we do that, so we work on that stuff, and we realise that in our data there were loads of people needing much more help. So that evolved into our Wellbeing Centre, so the case management tool that produces these sort of little, basically. So if we can see this stuff, what do we do with it? So system generates alerts now, creates little packages of anonymized data. Again, we're protecting the dignity and the identity of the individual, because I think that's crucial to trusting us and to providing the right sort of support early. But even then, so we sort of have this sort of way of looking at individualized data in a safe way. We go back to the pandemic, and you talked about you joining the work at that point. There was a point in the pandemic where, again, we have another sort of big moment for me, which was so again, it was related to this was just before we'd launched or we'd developed the algorithms. We were still working on them at this time, so we were still relying on people telling us, sharing their stories, if you like. And there was the only moment, I think, of suicide ideation. And I use that word carefully, but somebody in an organisation that we worked with, a man, as it turned out, just talking, was working at home, as we all were, just clearly under a huge amount of pressure, made a reference to, if it wasn't for his family, he was just about ready to step off the world. And that caused a reaction for lots of people, and so generates the sort of flags that the community support that we talk often about. And I know we want to talk a bit more about peer-to-peer support and its role, but but in there was in that sort of dignity and respect part of the process, it became evident that so lots of people were responding to this guy. The company was deeply concerned. They didn't have anybody trained to have a conversation. Nobody that felt comfortable. So all they were able to do was to basically offer a structured kind of HR conversation where they would say they wouldn't be able to give any counselling or any sort of support. It would be all about, this is what you can do, this is what you can do, this is what you can do. And the only way at that point, 2020, that we could reach this individual, because of the anonymity and the protections we put around individuals, was for me to email him. So again, we sort of dig out figure out who the user is, and I ended up sending an email saying, look, your colleagues are trying to reach you, and we want to, worried about you. People are worried about you. Can you do me a favor and just write back to me? And but that process, and we did get the support that was needed, and that was great. So a good outcome in the end. But it made me realise again that we have to close the loop inside the system so that we can provide better support live. And that's where the private messaging thing came about. So the ability for us to sort of complete the journey. So we're sort of building these pieces of capability, so we can now spot people much sooner through data. We know that we've got, through the narrative and the interaction capabilities, people can flag other people they're worried about their comments without knowing who they are. We create these little cases, anonymized data that provide a little insight into what might be going on. And then we build this sort of private messaging add-on that just means that we could then create a secure one-to-one link with that person. And do you know what? And so I'm really early on. I think we were really worried about that being a bit big brothery. I'm using this system, and suddenly I get a message from somebody. And do you know what? It is a bit big brothery, but only in the way you want that expression, what you want that to mean, right? So not the Orwellian version, but actually somebody looking out for you. And that's how people tended to respond to it. So you'd write to them. People inside the organisation, are you okay? Harkn's put up a flag. Do you need some help? And we've got some terrific stories that come out of that reaction, which is, I didn't know the system could do that, and I didn't know that. It's great that you care, and yeah, I'm having a tough time. It would be nice to talk, or I don't want to talk. I'm okay. There's a whole load of reactions, but people respond to it really well, and I think that changed the advice that we give around it. So rather than, initially we'd say, look, just when you're really worried about somebody, then you can reach out. But now, when people look like they're struggling, just send a bit of care, and that echoes. And just to lead me to, I know it's a bit of a monologue now, forgive me, but it'll just allow me to talk a little bit about the peer-to-peer stuff that I've alluded to. That sort of response kind of mirrors what we'd seen already in terms of, so the anonymity that I talk about so often and we protect so fervently is really a way that we know that people tend to say more stuff earlier. And it's not just about mental health, of course. It's about sharing experiences of the workplace and trying to learn from the good, the bad, the ugly stuff so that we can continue to make an organisation perform as well as it might, But so giving people a voice that's safe means they'll say stuff sooner. But when colleagues respond to us, relatedness, connection, that sort of stuff, when colleagues respond, even with it, if it's a hug emoji, the one that I've resisted the most over the years, that sort of idea that people care about me. I feel supported and like I'm part of something. So that's sort of sweet. That's our sort of journey. And I think it sort of, continues. And we've got, as I said, many amazing stories that we might talk about if we have time today. Shall I stop speaking?
No, great stories. Really great stories. And I think, as you say, people react really well when they get that anonymous message. And while it is anonymous, at the same time, they know that somebody in their organisation cares. And it's the same with the peer-to-peer support and like the outpouring of, just genuine human love and empathy and goodwill. It's like so striking. And I know that this is just a tiny bit of a subject change before coming back to peer support, but you and I, there's lots of articles coming out about organisations looking to robot counselling and having AI bots providing this support. And it just makes you, I think our experiences firsthand make you realise, certainly at the moment, it feels like that could never replace the kind of sincerity of one of your peers, like reaching out to you, or HR or wellbeing professional in your organisation reaching out to you and kind of, we talk a lot about people feeling heard and feeling valued, and the difference that makes to your morale and your wellbeing. And if can you feel heard and valued by a robot? I don't know what robots will look like in 10 years time, but I know it's a debate we have a lot, but at the moment it certainly feels you couldn't imagine it replacing genuine kind of wellbeing support. So peer support is something we've learned, again, through our own experiences, is really important to the wellbeing piece. It's not just about top-down initiatives. It's about having that lateral kind of visibility of each other. So how can organisations incorporating that into their wellbeing strategy? Because speak up, getting people to speak out and speak up and be open about these problems is probably still the biggest barrier to effective wellbeing strategy.
And you've grouped a few things absolutely correctly there as well, because they are all related. I think the support groups of all sorts exist, don't they? And why? Because they provide support for people. I think your point about bots is spot on as well. The idea that human to human connection is going to drive how we feel about work, and it's one of the challenges that we face, isn't it, in a sort of distributed workplace. I think some of us maybe even don't notice that the lack of connection that we experience, but that's where we are. And so So trying to change the way we engage with one another is important. The peer-to-peer bit, we'll trust a small number of people, won't we, to talk about stuff. We won't generally, they won't reveal our struggles to colleagues or to the organisation. So we can get that stuff happening. But if we want it to happen at scale, then we've got to do some other things. Speaking up is difficult, and I touched on it earlier on. Psychological safety being what it is, so we can be most effective. Your efforts in psychological safety are most effective in the team in which you work most regularly. Right? So I trust the people around me. I trust my boss. And I can engage with them. But I'm only going to reveal my struggles when I'm, like I said, when I'm absolutely certain that I can face the consequences that I perceive. Right? They don't have to be real consequences. They only have to imagine them. That'll stop me from speaking up. It's difficult. And there's lots of societal reasons why we won't speak up as well. So that, for me, there are loads and loads of ways that we can communicate with one another at work today, right? Whether it's Slack, Teams, Yammer, I could go on and on and on, I'm sure, about different mechanisms that we've got to engage one another. The thing that we can't get from that, of course, is the safety, the anonymity, the protected identity stuff that allows me to explore or make sense of even my own experiences a bit earlier. That's the piece that I think is critical. And lots of organisations resist the idea of anonymous stuff because, excuse me, they might just imagine or fear, let's put it that way, the fear that people are just going to say bad stuff, or just, we get bad news out there and it will just amplify, or it'll get said. Well, it tends not to happen that way, right? The thing that happens when somebody shares that they're struggling is they receive care, kindness, and support. People tend not to say, "Oh, do you know what? I feel crap too. I'm really struggling as well." They'll tend to say, did you know that there are support tools available? Have you spoken to somebody? Have you tried the EAP? So again, you think about all the things you have spent money on. What if you could target the people who really need it towards things right now? I use the Calm app. I use Headspace, whatever it might be. And forgive me to any of the, Thrive and all the other apps that exist out there. But so have you tried that? Yeah, I have. It doesn't work for me. So the thing about peer-to-peer is it reinforces connection, helps us make sense of stuff. But it also, can signpost us towards the help we need. The biggest issue, as I come right back to, is that we are not getting there soon enough. And that's, again, maybe it happens to, but when you create conditions in which people can speak safely and more freely and make sense of stuff earlier, that's the big thing, right? We're not. It's not that using Harkn is going to stop people from experiencing these things. It's more likely that they're going to just share it earlier because it's okay to do so, and you can be threatened by that insight, or you can embrace it and say, okay, well, let's get on top of this. And one of the wonderful things about humans at work is that they care about each other, right? There's something wrong with your organisation if people don't care about one another. You're all in the same context. You're all on the same ship. We use that analogy all the time. Or, I know some people like to call it a flotilla or whatever. But either way, you're all on the same mission, trying to achieve the same thing. And people in your group, in your tribe, who are not feeling terrific, probably need and deserve some support. And we're all willing to give it. That's, in the right context, makes a huge amount of difference. And as I say, I think the tooling is important.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're coming to the end of our conversation, but I think maybe it's worth finishing on as a little bit of a wrapping up exercise and a vision of the future of what does the future of workplace wellbeing look like, and what do organisations need to start doing to get there?
Yeah, well,
big question.
Great. Yeah, but it's a pretty good one, right? I think we probably, it's a great way to pull together some of the things that we talked about. Work has always evolved around the risks that it perceives, right? So it's not like we can often lose sight of the fact that workplaces haven't always been toxic. They're not all terrible places. They're dealing with the risks that they perceive all the time, right? So forever you look back and they're dealing with a different set of risks, and as society and technology and all those sorts of things evolve and the way work evolves, the physical risks of the workplace have largely been replaced with some mental ones now, emotional risks, and so we're starting to tackle those. Awareness of that has gone up immensely since 2020. That we were it felt like we were, there were technologies out there doing work in wellbeing pre-2020, but you didn't hear that much about them. And, so that market is expanding. We're caring much more about it. We're all much more aware of it. We all saw inside each other's bedrooms during the pandemic. And so we started to take a bit more notice of the things that individuals and the individual context that people had. So that journey is going to show no signs of stopping anytime soon. And things like the Oxford University report yesterday perhaps guide us in a better direction for what we need to do, right? So that's, we're on a journey where employee well-being is becoming more important. We know, I heard you talk about it, coming to work, changing jobs, staying where I am right now. Well, the provision for my well-being, so don't harm me and then try to fix me with an EAP only to put me back into harm's way. That's a cycle that we're going to see continue and change too, right? But so that's that's the journey, and I think we often say we're at the vanguard of something, doing something that nobody else has done yet. There's lots of check-in type technologies, but we've got to a point now where we can genuinely help organisations, and I want to just, if I can, and so I know that the question was about the future, but I want to just tie it to a story, right? And I think about this with one of our clients, and I won't name them, and it's the one that's the animation on the wellbeing page of our website, right? Where you get the guy that we know, he's sort of made himself known to us and talked about us, but where he goes onto Harkn and he talks about his mental health struggles, right? Triggered by a workplace incident the day before, which, as he described it, so this story is, and I know it was the conversation and the feedback was intended to help me, and I'm sure it will long term, but right now it's triggered something, and I know I've been through this cycle before. I'm spiraling. It's not going to be easy. It was a long piece, but thankfully my company's given me Harkn, and I can share my story with you guys, right? And then the peer support. 25 plus people responded over the next 24 hours. So everybody anonymous. Nobody called him out in any way, said, pull yourself together, pull your socks up, what's the matter with you? Nobody said any of that stuff. Everybody said, you know what? Well done for saying what you said. So brave of you to speak up. We're here for you. I've also struggled like this. I can tell you what, get some support. It's going to make all the difference. It's a long road, but it'll help. And then you conclude this story with the original guy coming back and saying, can I just thank you all? Harkn made it possible for me to speak, and you guys have given me the encouragement I needed to go and get some help. I have booked a counselling session through our EAP, right? And I love that story. And it doesn't quite end there, because the point is that individual then, and I heard this story in a sort of separate part where he then approached the CEO. And so I was telling that story to the CEO of this organisation when we caught up. And he said, oh, you don't know the ending. And I said, okay, well, tell me the ending. And he said, well, I was doing a show and came off the stage, and this guy came up to me and said, hi, I'm the guy off Harkn. And he said, I had to sort of gather myself a minute and try and sort of figure out what he was saying. Oh, I'm the guy that went in and shared that story and had that big response. And, and I just want to tell you, you saved my life. You created an amazing culture. You gave us this tool. And so the combination of those two things have made a massive difference. And now I love that story. And the reason it ties to what the future looks like, imagine if more, not far away, is it? That's a very near version of the future. But imagine if that were normal, right? So we're all susceptible to we're all susceptible to the pressures of life, and you never know when. You could argue that any one of us is only a few steps away from real hardship and difficulty, right? And but I love that. So that example, right? Imagine that as just the norm, and forget about all the AI stuff. Forget about all the amazing technologies that I'm sure will follow us. But a vision of the future right now says, what if we could just make that a bit more?
Yeah, I really like that. Well, I'm feeling very inspired after today's discussion. I feel very proud to be part of the Harkn movement. So I hope that those of you watching this feel equally inspired and motivated to make a difference in this space. If you like what you've watched, then please do subscribe to our channel. And in the description, I'll be leaving lots of different resources, our ebook, some of the articles and studies that we've mentioned today, and some other useful links. So be sure to have a look there as well. But thank you, David.
Brilliant. Great to have you back on. Might get you on the next one as well. It's good to have somebody to talk to. All right.
For a change.
Well done. Thanks, Lydia.
Please listen carefully.